The man on the operating table did not know who was standing over him. He was 61 years old, and the anesthesiologist had already done his work, so he lay perfectly still under the surgical lights with his chest rising and falling in the slow, measured way of a man who had put himself entirely in someone else's hands. His name was Gerald. He had a second wife at home in a house with a 3-car garage, and 2 sons who had never gone a single night wondering whether the lights would stay on. He had a pension and a boat he kept at the marina, and a doctor he golfed with on Saturdays. He had, by every measure that Gerald had ever chosen to use, a very good life. What he did not know was that the surgeon scrubbing in down the hall, pulling on her gloves with the practiced snap of someone who had done it 10,000 times, was his daughter, the one he had left. The one whose name he had stopped saying out loud sometime around her 7th birthday, when he had decided that a cleaner life was worth more than the messy one he had made. Her name was Naomi. She was 31 years old, and she had not seen her father's face in 24 years. She had no idea when the charge nurse handed her the chart that Tuesday morning that the name printed at the top was the same name she had spent most of her childhood waiting to hear at the door. She found out 30 seconds before she walked into that room. And she walked in anyway. If you have ever watched someone carry a thing that would have broken most people and carry it quietly, without complaint, without a word to anyone about the weight, then you already understand something about Naomi before this story even starts. If you've ever seen a woman give everything and receive almost nothing in return and keep giving anyway, drop a comment below because this one is for her. Now let me tell you how it happened. Naomi's mother, Diane, had been 26 years old when Gerald walked out. She had been a home health aide at the time, working split shifts to cover the mortgage on the small house in a neighborhood that was not fashionable but was hers. She had a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old and $11 in her checking account the week Gerald left because Gerald had cleaned out what there was of it 2 days before he told her he was going. He said he needed a fresh start. He said things had run their course. He said a lot of things, and Diane had stood in the kitchen doorway holding Naomi against her hip and listened to every word, and when he was finished she had said, quietly and without any particular ceremony, that she hoped whatever he was running toward was worth what he was running from. He had not answered that. He had picked up the bag he had already packed, and he had gone. Naomi had been 7 years old. She remembered the specific quality of the silence after the door closed, the way it settled into the house like weather. She remembered her mother setting her down very carefully, the way you set something fragile on a shelf, and walking to the sink and turning on the water, and standing there for a long time with her back to the room. Naomi had known, the way children know things they have no words for yet, that her mother was crying and did not want to be watched doing it. She had taken herself to the kitchen table and sat very still until the water turned off. That was the last night Diane cried in front of her children for 11 years. What followed was the kind of life that does not look like much from the outside because the people living it are too busy living it to perform it for anyone else. Diane worked. She worked the way people work when there is no margin, when there is no one to call if the car breaks down, when the question of whether the children eat a real dinner tonight is one she solves with whatever is in the refrigerator and whatever she can make it into. She picked up extra shifts. She took on a second job doing laundry for an elderly woman on Tuesdays. She bought Naomi's school clothes at the thrift store on Fairfield Avenue, 2 sizes up so they would last, and she hemmed the pants herself on a machine that had been her own mother's. She never once told either of her children they could not have the life they wanted. She told them the truth instead, which was that they would have to go get it themselves, and that she would be right behind them the whole way. Naomi's older brother Marcus had been 9 when Gerald left, and he had processed the loss the way 9-year-old boys sometimes do, which is to say he became very quiet for about 2 years and then very determined for the rest of his life. He went to work at 16 bagging groceries at the store 3 blocks from their house, and he gave half his check to Diane every 2 weeks without being asked. And when he graduated high school, he went to work full-time in logistics and did not look back. He was a steady and uncomplaining man, and Naomi loved him for exactly that. He had their mother's refusal to be broken by things that should have broken her. Naomi had something else. She had a fury that she had learned very early on to convert into fuel. It did not look like fury from the outside. From the outside it looked like diligence, like a child who read past her bedtime and checked out every book on the body that the library carried and asked her mother's colleagues questions that made them smile, and then actually pay attention. It looked like ambition. But underneath the ambition there was something hotter and more particular, a refusal to be what the leaving had implied she would be. Gerald had left because something better had presented itself. Naomi had decided, before she had words for the decision, that she would become something no one would ever leave behind. It started with a science textbook. She was 8 years old the year after Gerald left, and her third-grade teacher had given the class a chapter on the human heart. Naomi had taken the book home and read it 3 times in one night. She had looked at the diagram of the 4 chambers and the arrows showing how blood moved, and she had felt for the first time in a year something that was not grief and not hunger, and not the low-grade anxiety of a child who has learned that adults are not always reliable. She had felt interested. Interested was a door, and she walked through it and did not come back out. By 12, she was reading her mother's medical reference books. By 14, she had a part-time job as a receptionist at the neighbourhood clinic, answering phones after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the doctor who ran the clinic had noticed her and had started leaving journals on the desk with pages turned down. By 16, Naomi had a full scholarship to a magnet school across town, which meant an hour and 15 minutes on 2 buses each way, which meant waking at 5 in the morning and getting home after 7 at night. She did it for 2 years. She did not miss a day. Diane drove her to the bus stop on winter mornings when the temperature dropped below 20. She pressed a thermos of tea into Naomi's hands and watched the bus pull away and then went to work herself. She did not tell Naomi how proud she was because Naomi did not need to hear it. She could feel it in the thermos, in the hemmed pants, in the light always on when she came home. Some things do not need to be said to be known. There is a moment in some people's lives when the path they have been building finally holds their weight, and they step onto it and feel the solidity under their feet for the first time. And it is not triumph exactly, it is more like relief. The relief of a long proof finally done. Every line checking out. Naomi had that moment at 18 in the gymnasium of her magnet school when the principal read her name and her scholarship offer, and the room went quiet for just 1 beat before the applause. Full ride. Medical school track. She had walked across that stage with her chin level and her hands steady, and she had thought of her mother standing in front of a sink with the water running. She thought, not yet, but soon. Medical school was not kind to Naomi in the way that easy things are kind. It was kind the way a very long road is kind, which is that it goes somewhere real if you stay on it. She struggled in her first year the way most people do, and then she found her footing the way most people also do, and by her 3rd year she was being noticed by the cardiac surgery attending who ran the simulation lab. His name was Dr. Reyes, and he was precise and unsentimental, and he told Naomi directly in the hallway outside the lab on a Friday afternoon that she had the best spatial instincts he had seen in a resident in 8 years, and that she should be thinking about CT surgery. She had gone home and sat on the edge of her bed in her studio apartment and held that for a long time. Residency came next, and it was 7 years that she would not trade and could not fully describe to anyone who had not lived it. She was 30 hours on, 8 hours off, sometimes less, in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and cafeteria coffee, and the particular metallic edge of rooms where serious things happened. She learned to eat, standing up, and sleep in 20-minute windows, and hold a retractor for 4 hours without losing her focus. She learned that the body is more resilient than anyone tells you, and also more fragile, and that the line between those 2 things is where a surgeon lives. She had a mentor in her 4th year, a senior attending named Dr. Patrice Okoye, who ran the cardiac floor with a kind of brisk warmth that Naomi had recognized from the first day because it was the same register her mother used. Doctor. Okoye had pulled Naomi aside after a particularly long bypass case and said, without preamble, "You have something most people don't get trained into them. Don't let the schedule take it." Naomi had not asked what she meant. She already knew. She sent her mother a photograph from the day she matched into CT surgery. Diane had printed it and put it on the refrigerator, the one that hummed since Naomi was in middle school. It was still there on the day Naomi came home and found the new refrigerator, quieter, in its place, and the photograph transferred to the new door with a fresh magnet, careful as a reliquary. She was 25 years old. She had not spoken to her father in 18 years. She had not looked for him, not because she had forgotten him, but because she had decided, somewhere around her sophomore year of college, that the search would cost her something she needed for other things. She had put it in a box and sealed the box and set it on a high shelf, and she had not taken it down. The box came down the Tuesday morning she was handed the chart. She had been a fully trained cardiothoracic surgeon for 3 years by then. She was 31 and she was the youngest attending in the CT surgery department at the hospital, and she had 2 junior residents who followed her through the halls with something close to reverence, and she had earned every square inch of every credential she had. She came in early. She left late. She sent her mother flowers every Mother's Day and called every Sunday evening, and had paid off Diane's car 2 years ago without making a thing of it. She was, by any measure she chose to use, a woman who had built something real. She was standing at the nurse's station reviewing the morning board when the charge nurse handed her the consult chart for a new cardiac case, a 61-year-old male admitted overnight with a left main coronary artery blockage requiring emergency bypass. High risk. Scheduled for first slot in OR3 at 7:30. She opened the chart. She read the name. She read it again. Gerald Whitmore. Date of birth, September 14th, 1963. Next of kin, Patricia Whitmore, spouse. There was a photograph in the chart, the intake photo they took for ID purposes. She looked at it for 4 seconds. He was older, softer, his hair gone grey at the temples, but she knew the set of his jaw and the shape of his nose because she had inherited one of them, and she had spent years trying to forget the other. Her hand did not shake. That was the first thing she noticed. She had expected it to shake, but it did not. What she felt instead was a kind of stillness, a deep and particular quiet, as if every room she had walked through in 24 years had been leading to this hallway, this chart, this Tuesday morning. She stood at that nurse's station for 60 seconds. She did not move. The charge nurse, a woman named Paulette, who had worked with Naomi for 2 years and could read her the way you read weather, looked at her once and said nothing. Then Naomi closed the chart and walked down the hall to OR3. She had, before she walked in, done the only thing the situation required of her. She had thought about whether she could do this. She had not thought about whether she wanted to. She had thought about the chamber diagram in the 3rd grade textbook, and the thermos of tea in the dark, and the road that goes somewhere real if you stay on it. And she had thought about what it meant to be a surgeon, which is to say, what it meant to be a person who has trained herself to set everything she feels to the side of the table, and focus only on what is happening on it. She had answered her own question. She could do this. What she could not do, and did not try to do, was pretend the chart had a different name on it. The surgery was 4 hours and 12 minutes. It went without complication. Naomi closed with the precision she always brought, the sutures even and certain, the field clean. When she stepped back from the table, she felt the familiar pull of post-surgical quiet, that flat and functional calm that comes after the concentration breaks. She stripped her gloves and walked to the scrub sink and stood there a moment with the water running. Her mother came to mind. Of course she did. He was in recovery for 6 hours. His wife Patricia had been in the family waiting area since 7 in the morning. A small, well-dressed woman in her mid-50s who had brought a tote bag and a thermos of her own coffee, and who asked the floor coordinator twice whether there was any word. There was nothing unusual about her, Naomi thought, when she went to give the family update. She was simply a woman, afraid for her husband. Naomi had given 1,000 of these updates. She gave this one the same way she gave all of them, directly and clearly, and with her eyes on Patricia's face. The surgery was successful, she said. He came through without complications. He's in recovery and he'll be moved to the cardiac ICU within the hour. Patricia pressed both hands to her mouth. Her eyes filled. Thank God, she said. Thank you. Naomi said what she always said, which was that she was glad she could help, and she turned to go. Can I ask your name? Patricia said. I want to be able to tell him who saved his life. There was a beat. One beat. Nothing more. Naomi, she said. Naomi Whitmore. She watched it cross Patricia's face, the small, confused frown of someone who has heard something that doesn't fit the shape of what they know. Whitmore, Patricia said very carefully. Yes, Naomi said. And then, because the truth was going to come out one way or another, and Naomi had never in her life preferred a slow cruelty over a clean one, she said, His daughter from his first marriage. I've been his surgeon today. He didn't know, and I expect he'll have questions when he wakes up. But he's alive, and he's going to stay that way. She held Patricia's eyes for a moment longer, then she walked back toward the unit. She called her mother that evening, not from the hospital. She drove home first, changed her clothes, sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, and then she called. Diane answered on the second ring the way she always did and said, "Hey, baby," the way she always said it, warm and unhurried, as if she had been waiting for exactly this call. Naomi told her, all of it, the chart, the name, the photograph, the 4 hours and 12 minutes, Patricia's face in the waiting area. She told it plainly, the way she had always told her mother things without dress-up or embellishment, because Diane had never once needed either. She told it in order, the way she charted a case, because that was how her mind organized things that were too large to hold in one piece, by sequencing them, by making the overwhelming into something that could be reviewed, one step at a time. When she finished, there was a silence on the line, not the hollow silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the full silence of someone who was taking everything in. Diane had always done that. She had always given her full weight to what she was told. Diane was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," Naomi said. And it was true, she was not broken. She was not triumphant. She was, she realized, something she had not quite expected to be. Settled. As if a very old question had finally been answered, not with words, but with the simple fact of what had happened and what had not. "Baby," Diane said, "you just did the hardest thing." "I did my job," Naomi said. "That's what I said." They stayed on the line a while after that, not saying much the way they sometimes did. It was enough to have the other person there. Diane was 55 years old, and she had been up since 5 in the morning for most of her adult life. And she sounded tired in the good way now, the way of a woman who had worked hard and was resting, not the desperate tired of those early years. She had cut back to part-time the previous fall. Naomi had made that possible, not with a ceremony or a speech, but simply by ensuring, month by month, that the numbers worked. Diane had not thanked her for it extensively. She had said, "All right, baby," when Naomi told her it was arranged, and that was enough. They didn't need more words than they needed. Gerald was moved to the cardiac ICU at 9 that evening, and he was awake, groggy and raw-throated from the intubation, by 10. Patricia was with him. She had not told him yet. She was holding his hand and watching the monitor, and not saying a word because she did not know what words were right for this, and she was, it turned out, a woman wise enough to know when she didn't have them. He found out the next morning. His cardiologist, making rounds, mentioned the attending surgeon by name. Gerald went still in the bed. He asked the cardiologist to repeat it. The cardiologist did. Gerald looked at the ceiling for a long moment, and then he turned his face toward the window, and Patricia, who was watching, saw something move across him that she had never seen before in the 18 years she had known him. She would not have been able to name it exactly. It was not quite grief, and not quite shame. It was something older than both of those things, the particular heaviness of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of what he walked away from. He asked to see her. The floor nurse relayed the request. Naomi sat with the request for 20 minutes before she responded to it. She was in the attending lounge on 4, eating a sandwich she had not tasted, and she was thinking about a thing her mother had said once, years ago, when Naomi had asked why Diane never talked badly about Gerald in front of her and Marcus. Diane had set down what she was doing and considered the question with the full weight she gave all serious questions. She had said, "Because I decided a long time ago that my feelings about your father were mine to carry, not yours. You didn't do anything wrong." Naomi had been 15 when she heard that. She was 31 now, and she understood it differently than she had then, understood it as the specific and deliberate mercy it was, the choice a person makes to not pass a wound down the line. She finished the sandwich. She went back to the floor. Naomi came at the end of her shift. She stood in the doorway of his room and looked at him in the bed, and he looked back at her. He had her jaw and her hands, or she had his, and that was something that neither of them could do anything about. He looked like a man who had prepared a speech and understood, now that she was in the room, that no speech was equal to the occasion. "Naomi," he said. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. The formality was not cruelty. It was simply what was true. He flinched slightly. "I don't know where to start," he said. "You don't have to start anywhere," she said. You had a left main coronary artery blockage. You had emergency bypass surgery yesterday morning. You're going to need 6 weeks of cardiac rehabilitation, and you'll need to make changes to your diet and activity level. Your cardiologist will go over all of that with you. I came to check on your surgical site and to tell you that everything looks good. He looked at his hands. His eyes were wet, and he was, she could see, not a man who had cried easily or often. I know I don't deserve anything from you, he said. No, she agreed gently. You don't. I should have, he began. There's no excuse. I know there's no excuse. There isn't, she said. But you're not my patient anymore after today. You'll be discharged to your cardiologist's care by the end of the week. What happens after that is between you and your family. She paused. Your whole family. If you want to be in contact, you know where to find me. If you don't, that's also a choice you're allowed to make. But I'd ask you to think about Marcus. He was 9 years old. Gerald closed his eyes. She checked his surgical site. The wound was clean and healing. She charted her notes, told him to rest, told him to take the rehabilitation seriously, and she left the room. In the hallway outside, she stood for a moment with her hand flat against the cool wall. She breathed once, long and even. She thought about the silence after the door closed, 24 years ago. She thought about how a silence like that can hollow out a child's understanding of what she deserves, and how a child can spend years rebuilding what the silence took. She thought about her mother at the sink with the water running, her back to the room, not wanting to be watched. She also thought about what had not happened. She had not flinched in the OR. She had not made an error. She had not let the name on the chart change the quality of her hands or the steadiness of her attention. She had kept 4 hours and 12 minutes of her own best work between Gerald Whitmore and a death that had nothing to do with what he deserved. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, almost everything. The people who would have said she should have refused the case, who would have called a colleague and handed the chart over, those people had not been in that hallway at 7:15 in the morning, holding a chart and understanding, in the space of 4 seconds, that the world had chosen this particular Tuesday to settle a very old account. She had not been tested on what she planned to do. She had been tested on who she was. She had passed. She pushed off the wall and walked toward the elevator. There is something the world rarely admits about the children of people who leave, which is that the leaving does not make them smaller. Sometimes it makes them something entirely other. Sometimes the empty place where a parent was becomes a room a child builds something in, and what they build there is harder and more precise and more useful than anything the parent would have given them. Naomi had not become a surgeon to prove something to Gerald. She had become a surgeon because of a diagram in a 3rd-grade textbook, and a doctor who left journals on a desk with pages turned down, and a mother who got up every morning and stood at a sink and turned the water on and chose, despite everything, to keep going. She had become a surgeon because she was good at it, because her hands were steady and her mind was fast, and she loved the specific and necessary miracle of it, the way a body could be opened and repaired and closed again and go on living. Gerald had given her nothing, but the absence of him had given her, in a way neither of them would have chosen, everything she needed to become who she was. Marcus drove down from Columbus 3 weeks later, after Gerald had been discharged and after a letter had arrived at the house on Fairfield Avenue. A real letter, handwritten on plain paper, addressed to Diane. She had read it once and folded it back into the envelope without a word. Marcus had asked her about it on the phone and she had said, "He wrote." That was all. She had not said what it contained, and neither Marcus nor Naomi had pushed, because they had both grown up in this house and they knew their mother's quiet, which was not withholding but was private, the quiet of a woman who had learned long ago to process things in her own time. He and Naomi met at their mother's kitchen table the way they always had, with the overhead light on and cups of coffee in front of them, and Diane moving around the kitchen behind them, not sitting. Not yet, in the way she had always processed things on her feet. Marcus was 43 now, broad-shouldered with grey beginning at his temples, in the same way it had come for Gerald. He had driven 4.5 hours and he was tired, and he sat across from his sister and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. He had the same eyes as their mother, wide-set and direct, eyes that looked at you rather than around you. "You didn't have to do it," he said. "I know," she said. "But you did." "Yes." He nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee and held it with both hands. Mama told me about the letter. Says he wants to meet. Both of us. Naomi looked at the table. What do you want to do? Marcus was quiet for a while. The refrigerator hummed. From the stove, Diane shifted a pan from one burner to another, that particular soft scrape of cast iron that had been the sound of dinner being made in this kitchen for as long as either of them could remember. Marcus looked at the stove when it happened. Naomi saw his jaw tighten and release. The private calculation of a man who had been 9 years old and had never quite stopped being 9 years old about one particular thing. I think, Marcus said finally, that I'm willing to hear what he has to say. Once, I'm not ready to give him more than that. That's fair, Naomi said. You? She thought about it. She thought about the man in the hospital bed with his hands in his lap and his eyes wet, and she thought about what it would mean to let him back into her life, even partially, even carefully, even on her own terms. She thought about what it would not mean, which is to say, she thought about the fact that it would not mean she owed him anything, and it would not undo what he had done, and it would not require her to carry anything she did not choose to carry. Once, she said. Same as you. Diane set a pot of rice on the table and sat down. She looked at both of them and then she looked at her hands for a moment. She said, whatever you two decide, I need you to know that what happens with him is separate from what I know. What I know is that I got to watch both of you grow into people I am proud of every single day of my life. She paused. That man missed it. That's his loss, and it can't be fixed. But it's done. You're both here. Marcus put his hand over his mother's on the table. Naomi looked at them both, at the overhead light, at the kitchen she had grown up in, at the cast-iron pan on the stove that had been in this house as long as she could remember. She thought, this is what stayed. This is what held. There was a meeting, eventually, a diner, neutral ground on a Saturday morning in November. Gerald came alone. He was thinner than he had been in the hospital, and he was dressed plainly, none of the golf club ease he had worn in the intake photograph. He had the look of a man who had thought very hard about something and had not arrived at any comfortable conclusion. He was already seated when Naomi and Marcus came in, a corner booth near the window, and he saw them through the glass a beat before they came through the door. Naomi saw him see them. She saw what moved across his face. It was not the look of a man who was glad to have what he wanted. It was something more humbled than that, the look of someone who understands that they are receiving grace they did not earn and is not sure what to do with the weight of it. He stood when he saw them. He did not reach for them. He seemed to understand, without being told, that reaching was not his right. They sat. They ordered coffee. Gerald sat with his hands wrapped around his mug, not drinking it, and he began to speak in the measured way of a man who had rehearsed something and then set the rehearsal aside. He said that he had been thinking since the hospital about what to say and had not found anything that was equal to what he owed them, and that he had decided the only honest thing was to say that plainly instead of trying to dress up an inadequate accounting as something more than it was. He said he had left because he had been selfish and afraid, and because he had looked at the life he was in and seen the difficulty of it more clearly than he saw what he was about to take from two children who had not asked for any of it. He said he had told himself things to make it easier to live with, the way people do, and that he had mostly managed not to look at those things too carefully for 20 years, and that the morning he woke up in a hospital bed and was told by his cardiologist, who his surgeon had been, he had looked at all of it at once and had not been able to stop looking. He did not cry. He was shaking slightly, but he didn't cry. He said he was not asking for anything. He was not. He said he had wanted them to hear it from him in person, and then whatever they chose to do was theirs to choose. Marcus listened. He asked two questions, quietly and directly, in the way he did everything, and Gerald answered them without deflecting. The first question was whether Gerald had ever tried to reach them after he left. Gerald said he had not. He said he had told himself it was cleaner that way, meaning cleaner for him, and that he understood now what that cost. The second question Marcus asked was whether Gerald had other children. Gerald said yes, 2 sons with Patricia, 20 and 17. Marcus nodded once and looked out the window for a moment, and then looked back. Neither question had a good answer. Gerald seemed to know that. Naomi said very little. She did not need to say much. She had already done the thing that mattered. She had stood over him in that room, and she had put the right instruments in her hands, and she had repaired what was broken in him. Not because he had earned it, but because that was her job, and she was the kind of person who does her job completely, regardless of who is on the table. She had saved a man's life. The fact that the man was her father was between her and whatever she believed about the way the world keeps its accounts. She did not forgive him that morning. She did not know if she would. Forgiveness was not a thing she owed him, and she was not going to offer it on a schedule that wasn't hers. But she was there, at the table, drinking her coffee, and she was not closed. That was the beginning of something, though she did not give it a name. The winter was cold and long, and Diane's house on Fairfield Avenue was warm, the way it had always been, with the overhead light and the cast-iron pan, and Marcus calling on Sunday evenings the same as Naomi did. Diane had replaced the old refrigerator finally, the one that had hummed since Naomi was in middle school. The new one was quieter. It changed the texture of the kitchen in a way that took some getting used to. In the spring, Naomi was offered a fellowship at a hospital 2 states away, a 2-year position that would have put her at the leading edge of minimally invasive cardiac techniques. She thought about it for 3 weeks. She called Dr. Reyes, who was retired now but still picked up when she called. She called Marcus. She did not call her father. She accepted the fellowship. The morning she left, Diane walked her to the car. It was early, 6:15, the sky just going pale at the edges. Diane was in her housecoat and slippers, her grey hair loose, and she held Naomi's face in both hands for a moment before she let her go. She did not say much. She had never needed to say much. In the passenger seat of the car, Naomi had set one thing, the 3rd grade science textbook. She had kept it all these years, the spine taped and the cover bent, because it was the door she had walked through and she had never been able to throw it away. The diagram of the 4 chambers was still there on page 47, the arrow still showing how blood moves in the only direction it knows. She backed out of the driveway. She watched her mother in the rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the yard in her housecoat, arms crossed against the morning chill, watching until the car turned the corner. Kindness does not always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it looks like a thermos of tea in the dark. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing at a sink choosing to get up. Sometimes it looks like steady hands and a repaired heart, and a door held open even when no one opened one for you. Naomi drove toward the highway, the textbook on the seat beside her, the early light spreading out ahead. She did not look back. She did not need to. Everything that had made her was already in the car. Tell me in the comments, would you have walked into that room? And if you want another story about a woman who carried more than she should have had to and came out carrying something worth keeping, stay right here. There's one more waiting for you.